we're here to talk about recognising and owning our church's past in terms of past injustices. And Benda's work in this area, I've only met Benda today for the first time actually, but I knew Benda's work, and his work in this area started, as Bill mentions, with looking at the Rwandan genocide. So I thought, Benda, perhaps you could kick off by telling us what you found in your research.
So I'm going to start by giving some form of context. I have realized that you can't assume that because something is so familiar for you and has shaped your life in a tremendous way that everybody actually is aware of that. So the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda took place in 1994 from April to July 1994. And in the space of 3 months, 1 million people were killed. And at the time of the genocide, which actually happened 3 days after Easter 1994, Rwanda was, and I think it still is, more than 90% Christian. It is estimated that 95% of the victims of genocide were Christians, and 95% of the perpetrators of genocide were Christian. It was also estimated that 75%, at least 75% of the people who died in the genocide were killed on church premises, whether in churches, hospitals, and schools. Personal note, I had just converted to Pentecostalism, having spent years in Catholicism and training to be a Catholic priest and then working. And then I just started my studies in the Faculty of Law. I'm bringing these things together because I think, for me, faith and law were the key pillars really for my understanding of myself, but also of my agency as a Christian in a troubled time. It was also a time of civil wars. There was a civil war going on since 1990 and finished with the genocide in 1994. So this, again, it's in these troubled times, for me, clarity was found in faith, and sort of intellectual and a logical understanding of what was happening was located in law. And when I started my research on the genocide, I worked on the premise of Psalm 11, verses 3 to 4, that when all the foundations or foundation of society and law order have been destroyed, at least the church, the Christian church of faith and Christian church, should be one of those institutions that people should look up to for personal and corporate agency or action. Obviously, the balance sheet that I presented in the beginning says that it didn't work. So that led me to say, what are the theological, the social, historical factors that made this failure possible? I'm not going to bore with the details because people tend to go on and on about their research. But what I have found is that when it comes to our church, sometimes it's very easy to be impressed by the size of the giant or the statues and failing to see the sort of decaying clay that is in the foundations. So when I start looking at the history of the church in Rwanda, I realized that there had been so many compromises and inter-elite co-options, economical trade-offs, and sort of very passive political theologies, so much so that when the genocide started, those theologies really rendered the church incapable to challenge, but also incapable to guide.
Mm-hmm. So yeah. That's interesting because I've been working recently on the early Methodism and slavery, the enslavement of Africans and the slave trade, and the standard story there is quite straightforward and quite encouraging for Methodists, because it is that John Wesley is portrayed as an abolitionist, and indeed in 1774 he published very hard-hitting thoughts upon slavery, and that began a campaign which lasted the rest of his life against enslavement and the slave trade, which he undertook at some personal risk. And famously, the last letter we have written by John Wesley was sent to William Wilberforce to encourage him in the fight for abolition of the slave trade. But when you look a bit deeper, which I've been trying to do over the last few months, you find it's a bit more complicated. So one thing that's very striking and has puzzled scholars is that we know that John Wesley first met enslaved people in Georgia, in America, as a missionary in the mid-1730s. But he said very little about slavery for 40 years. And people puzzle as to why he was silent, virtually silent, for so long. Another point which is increasingly understood is that the transatlantic slave trade was central to the entire economy in the 18th century. And if you take Bristol, which was a centre of early Methodism, where both Charles and John Wesley were based for a period, it's estimated that about 40% of the economy of that port was directly linked to the kidnapping and trafficking of Africans in the transatlantic slave trade. So for the rank and file Methodists of Bristol, it would probably have been impossible not to have some engagement with slavery. And also I found when you look at John Wesley's friends, I mean, when he began his mission to revitalise the church, which was what his aim was, he had almost no money. There was no, unlike the Church of England, there's no endowment, there's no land, there are no buildings, there are no legacies. He had to raise the money. And he raised the money in two key ways: from the penny a week, which the rank and file would pay, it's probably about £5 a week for us now, would pay towards the expenses of the preachers. And also he sought money from wealthy people he knew. As an Anglican clergyman, he was quite well connected, even with the court. He was well known, increasingly so as life went on. And so he picked the pockets of his wealthy friends. And quite a few of these were involved in the slave trade. They were slave holders, slave owners. They were, at least one case I found of if you could believe it, a so-called Methodist slave trader. So they do appear to have existed, though not in any great numbers. Others were involved in the sugar trade, which was built on the backs of the enslaved Africans working in the Caribbean. So it's a more complicated story, where behind the headline, if you like, of which we can take comfort in, of abolition, there is some degree of involvement. I wouldn't say complicity, but some degree of involvement with the slave trade and with enslavement.
I recently read or reread Eric Williams' Slavery and Capitalism, and I think what it should be on every university and academic institution reading list. Anybody who is interested in understanding these issues. But obviously, and again, the thing is, the people who come after, it's so easy to look back and judge those who have come before us, and the dead can't speak for themselves. So, my question to you is, how do you go about new work, new research to sort of this task of judging the behavior of our 18th century forebearers?
Well, I agree. It's very easy to condemn from a distance, and of course the dead can't answer back. One thing we can do, we can compare early Methodists with Christians from other denominations, if you like. So the Church of England, for example, officially endorsed the slave trade. Members of the church participated in the slave trade. There were church-owned slaves, which were branded with the church's logo on their foreheads in the West Indies. And they invested in the South Sea Company and other slave trading ventures. So the Church of England, you could say, was directly and officially involved. One complication is that we can't think of the Methodist Church in the 18th century as being an organisation in the way that we would see it now. So there was a group of people around John and Charles Wesley who were travelling evangelists. There were local preachers emerging. There were local societies. But if you look for the decision-making body, there was no kind of investment committee. There was no central fund. It was all matters of small amounts of cash being handed around. So even pinning down who was the church, I think, is quite difficult. One thing I have found troubling in my research, and I'm not a theologian, unlike you, is the theology around providence. Because it seems to me, reading the early documents, that this is very often used as an excuse. And a good example would be John Newton, the author of, not a Methodist, but the author of Amazing Grace, who was, first of all, he was a sailor on slave trading ships. And it's quite a confused chronology, but apparently after his conversion, he took a job as a slave ship captain. And he struggled to explain how he could do this. And he used this phrase, God is the great disposer. So his argument was, it may not be very good what I'm doing, but life is complicated. And if the Almighty thinks that this is okay, then it's okay for me. So the doctrine of providence is very frequently found in the early records, explaining why it's okay to kidnap people. It's okay to work them to death because it's part of God's divine plan. And this happens that I'm the captain of the ship and you're down in the hold below. So whenever I see the word providence in early documents, that's a red flag. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you about is that is the texture of what you do, because again, you can make grand statements about historical trends and so on, but I think the role of the historian is to go behind the headlines and to test hypotheses and to pick out individual stories, as Pippa said, which illustrate what's really going on. So is that something you've come across in your work on Rwanda?
Yes, and obviously studying, because I undertook a comparative study between, I was trying to test Christianity vis-a-vis Islam and how different institutions and different and religious bodies informed by different histories and different theologies react to situations of extreme violence. As you can tell, I started with a sort of righteous anger because I couldn't get my head around the fact that actually people who should have known better didn't do much, and that Muslims, of all things, could perform or outperform us in terms of ethical reaction or action in a situation such as genocides. But then obviously you begin to look into origins and how, actually whether this really stands. And what I realized that I had to locate the church in the context of expectations and historical expectations, pretty much in the sense of those to whom a lot has been given, much is expected and much should be asked of. The tricky part, I think, when I began to explore the history of the church is, I just realized that that's probably what you were saying, that although the church is not of this world, it most certainly is in this world. And there are complex and intricate relationships that happen between different aspects of society. What I found about Rwanda was the way the church struggled to evangelize without going through the aristocracy, the Rwandan aristocracy. And that then led to a certain type of Constantinianism, a la Rwandese, so to speak, through which the church began to flatter the Tutsi elite. And then that led to drawing on some questionable scientific theories, like the Hamitic theories. And I'm not going to do that, but it's just basically something that's anything that is good in Africa has come from European or Indo-European, so has somehow, for being exposed to the sun, have been darkened. And that basically then created this sort of inevitable co-option between the church and the state. So this sort of pragmatic mission led to quite a significant unintended consequences. So and then what I keep realizing through the history of the Rwandan church is that through the history of these institutions, each time there is a change in the politics, the ethnic identity of the political leadership mirrors the ethnic identity of the church leadership. And it's not by magic and it's not by divine appointment. What the consequence and what is undeniable is that telling truth to power becomes quite complicated.
Well, the Methodists didn't have a kind of hereditary aristocracy in that way, because from the beginning, the movement was built both from the top down, but also from the bottom up. So you had local societies, local classes, and there was a kind of career path from the earliest days. You could be a class leader, and they would be drawn from all sectors of society. From that, you could become a preacher. You could then become perhaps a full-time preacher, and you could progress through the movement in that way. So in that sense, it was a mass movement in a way that perhaps the church in Rwanda wasn't. But trying to recover the histories of those individuals is extraordinarily difficult. And occasionally I come across a story which I latch onto because it illuminates, and I give an example now of one I came across, which was somebody called William Dyer. And William Dyer was an apothecary, a kind of medical practitioner in the 1750s, 1760s in Bristol. And he went to the Methodist Society run by John and Charles Wesley and often heard them preach. And little bits of his diary have survived. So from that we know that one of his patients was a guy called James LaRoche, who was the most successful slave trader in Bristol. On one particular day I found William Dyer went to attend to James LaRoche, for which he was paid. And then he went along to the Methodist meeting where there's a collection. Now I can't prove this, but it seems to be highly likely that one or two of the coins that LaRoche gave him for his treatment ended up in the offertory. But I now said to myself, well, you know, what would I have done? I mean, there's no health service, there are no GPs, so he's acting, if you like, as a public medical practitioner. Should he have refused to treat James LaRoche as a protest against his well-known involvement in the slave trade? Or should the Methodists refuse to take the money from Dyer, knowing that's where it came from? I mean, it's just intriguing, isn't it? But you have to get right down into the individual histories with a sense of humility and empathy, trying to understand what's really going on. Have you come across stories like that which you felt?
I think because I work primarily with institutions, so the corporate aspect of the church, so it's very difficult to get to find individuals in particular. But there are a few stories you come across. One of which is the first really Archbishop of Rwanda, who was more senior class, and the sort of grand affair he had to go through. He had basically single-handedly to remove the Rwandan monarch so that the country can be evangelized. On one hand, as a Christian, you think, we want the kingdom of God to penetrate these societies. But then when you look at the upheaval and the seeds of violence that were sowed by that sort of act of intrusion, you wonder if there should have been more wisdom.
Now you began your career as a lawyer, as we heard, and I wonder what role you think the law played or should play in this kind of intercommunal tension that you found in 1994 Rwanda.
I was passionate about law, so I started law at the time of war, and I was really interested in how we were going to be able to set up a united nation. And I thought the only way we could do this is having a good constitution. So that's why we went to do constitutional law. Obviously, people like British who do not have a constitution. This sounds like a challenging thing to do, but we thought that one of those things that are really important is having a very solid and constitution. And part of that, obviously, is the whole legal framework and the rule of law and so on and so forth. My greatest disappointment is how law capitulated in 1994. And I think that is the trouble with legal institutions. Legal institutions in which we invest our faith and our belief, and they're part of what makes us proud of belonging to a society, of belonging to a country. And then I just realized how much law and the legal framework is a tool. Literally, it's an instrument, and how it can be manipulated, held up, upheld, abrogated, suspended, and so on and so forth in time of conflict. And then when the conflict is over, then the law comes back and say, okay, I'm in operation again. What I found intriguing in the genocide is that law was both absent and present in the sense that everybody became a law unto themselves. When I was fleeing and running from killers, I remember being arrested at roundabout by probably a boy who was no more than 16. And I said, sit down, and I sat down, and said, remove your shoes, and it's just in a way, every citizen and every person becomes a law unto themselves. And I don't think that we have an expression when law is so completely appended, on its head, so much so that what was unacceptable, illegal becomes the norm, but in Rwanda, obviously, then the act of killing became the norm, and the criminal became the person who was not responding to this injunction. So, what I'm trying to say is, law, it was one of those things I thought, okay, alongside faith in the public sphere, this is something we can rely on to see us through. And I realized that it is another tool that can be used in the hand of those who have the power to manipulate it at the time. And I'm very much aware that this is quite an extreme case, but maybe you could yourself, mutatis mutandis, as they say, make it relevant to our current discussion by showing how the British law may be shaped, participated, contributed to 18th century slavery enterprise.
It did. I mean, 18th century Britain would regard itself very much as a law-abiding society, a society built on rules with the impartial administration of justice. But we're talking about the period before the French Revolution. When the French Revolution came in to simplify the ideas of human rights, individual liberty came to the fore. But before then, probably the single most important concept in the legal framework was that of property, the sanctity, the use of sanctity of property rights. And this was, I think, fatal for Africans, because once you can see that one person can own another person, then the entire edifice of law can be used to support that system. And I came across an example of Philip Gibbs, who was a friend of John Wesley. And he, in the way they did in those days, he had plantations in the Caribbean, and he put in an order to some merchant for a certain number of Africans to be kidnapped and brought to his plantation. And on a particular occasion, when the slave Africans arrived, they had a very rough journey, as they usually did. Some had died, many were sick. And he complained that the cargo, that's the word they would use, of enslaved Africans was not up to the standard which he had ordered. And he complained under consumer law that the law was there to protect him and his interests. And that's obviously, we've said, abuse and corruption. But then I reflected that when the East India Company, when they first moved to India, first of all for trade, then led to conquest. They found millions of Indians who were enslaved by other Indians. And in both the Hindu princely states and the Muslim princely states, slavery was entirely embedded in legal system. So when we condemn, the 18th century folk, well, as one should, of course, you have to say that what they thought they were seeing in slavery was a universal institution. Everywhere they went on their voyages, it's the same the Aztecs in Latin America. Wherever they went on the planet, they found slaves. So they thought nothing is a universal law. It's part of God's disposition, and why would we challenge it? It took great courage for people like Wesley and the Quakers and others, Wilberforce and Granville Sharp, to see through this, what appeared to be entirely universal part of the fabric of being human, was that at the bottom of the pyramid, there were people who were enslaved.
I'm just trying to think there are new films and new programs that currently are showing that probably indigenous people themselves weren't so keen on slavery as an enterprise, and certainly what became chattel slavery should have been problematized by people who knew better. I think. And I think what you and I are trying to do here is how easy it is to hide behind these institutions, because the law can be harsh, but the Latin is yes, lex dura. It can be tough, but my question was beyond law, and I'm sure you've said this. To what extent Methodists have attacked these sort of injustices as an established church, if it's a clear case, if there are instances, if there are documents in the work you found, beyond just Wesleyan document.
No, I mean, looking back on the early years of the movement, there are many things in which, as I've said today, which we can take some comfort and some pride as part of our heritage. John Wesley and his associates were clearly very concerned about the poor. They offered practical help through the Strangers' Friend Societies, through workshops for the unemployed. They ran schools for the poor. Primitive physics has been mentioned. They ran dispensaries for the poor. So there are many ways in which we can say that the social justice is in the DNA of Methodism. But again, if you look a little bit further, you can see there are some troubling things which we shouldn't ignore. And one which has received very little attention to me is the attitude of early Methodists to the Irish. Now this is complicated because at the time Ireland was mainly Catholic, of course, and Catholicism was difficult for people in the rest of Britain to accept because the Pope was seen as a foreign monarch, and Catholic states such as France were seen as threats and enemies who were interfering in Britain. So it's partly a political point. But there's no doubt that John Wesley and his associates were extremely anti-Irish. It was just a complete blind spot. They regarded the Irish as barbarians and people who were literally beyond the pale. The approach to women in Methodism, again, is also has much which we could admire, but other things are troubling. Women were very important in early Methodism. Probably a majority of the class leaders were women, but they had a clearly secondary role. And indeed, in 1803, the conference essentially banned women from preaching. So that's a retrograde step. After having had early preachers in the early years, from 1803, they were effectively banned. So although, as I say, the legacy has much good in it, it's a mixed legacy, and we shouldn't be complacent at all. On the contrary, we should be actively ensuring that we pursue social justice now in all its manifestations.
I'm being aware of the time. I think I'm going to see to what extent then we should take responsibility for the past. I don't know if you want to start. You want me to
I think it's too easy to condemn people in the past. The approach I would like to say is that we have a legacy, which is a mixed legacy. But in the case of Methodism, it's not just a legacy in terms of our theology, but it's a legacy, for example, in terms of the buildings and the wealth which we have. And this is an example of the legacy of Methodism. And our responsibility here, I think, on this campus, for example, is to say, are we using these resources to support the church's mission, to support the poor, to support the oppressed in the way that we should? That's the way we can best honour those in the past. Rather than spending so much time criticising them, I think we should accept what we get from the past and then ask ourselves a more difficult question. Are we using the gifts that we have been given by God through our forebears to meet the needs of the present day? What would be your view?
Obviously, the church in Rwanda is faced with a complicated legacy, and that's the legacy of genocide and the imperative of reconciliation. The problem is that when you have been so uninvolved in the conflict and you fail to provide any form of moral guidance, it becomes then very difficult to position yourself as a minister of reconciliation. And when you have always let the sort of state and the political apparatus take the first step, you're always playing catch up. I think what I found deplorable in the church is the time it took Christian churches, to confess or at least to take stock of what had happened. In fact, I found really offensive that after the genocide, church practices continued seamlessly without taking stock of the past. And I think it's very important that the church recognizes that was, and it's very difficult to take the responsibility collectively and appropriately. But I think the leadership of the church should be able to offer that exemplar in terms of confession and humility in recognizing how that we kind of be quite fearful of politics of atrocities, and we don't always come out as a hero. It is also incredible to realize that, and this is something that has been researched and proved in most researches on atrocities, that there are always individuals, there will always be people, those people who will refuse to bow to oppression, and certainly there were individuals in the London church. And I think sometimes, because I'm so judgmental of the church, I forget that there were institutions that opened the door to the victims. So the 75% of people died in the church because the priest actually opened the doors. And quite a few of those priests and ministers died with the congregation. So one of the approaches that I try to champion this is to start with these instances of what I call positive deviance, of people who refuse to bow down, and actually see, how do we study, how do we look at these characters who are very disparate and try to draw lessons, and probably what you call Genesis from a bottom up, beginning to look at actual history of individuals who withstand sort of pressures, and now see how we can then derive a practical theology of resistance and ethical action in this time of political upheaval.